Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thank you, Rick. I am genuinely excited about today's subject because it sits right at the collision point between artificial intelligence and the physical electric grid that powers it.
So let's set the stage for everyone listening because this story broke on June 18th, 2026. And I think most people completely missed how big it actually is.
You're absolutely right that it flew under the radar because the headline involves a federal energy regulator, and most people scroll right past anything that sounds like utility paperwork.
Exactly, but here is why everyone should care. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which we will call FERC, just issued 6 orders that could reshape where every AI data center in America gets built.
Let me give the precise mechanics, because the details matter enormously here. FERC issued what are called show cause orders under Section 206 of the Federal Power Act.
Now, I want to slow down on that phrase because a show cause order sounds intimidating and bureaucratic. So help our listeners understand what it actually forces these grid operators to do.
A show cause order essentially means the regulator is telling you to either justify your current rules or change them immediately, and the burden of proof now sits squarely on the operator.
So instead of FERC writing a brand new rule book from scratch, they are flipping the responsibility onto the grid operators and saying, prove your system works or fix it fast.
Precisely. And the 6 targets are the big regional operators: PJM Interconnection, the Mid-Continent System, Southwest Power Pool, the California System, ISO New England, and the New York System Operator.
I noticed one giant name is conspicuously missing from that list, and it happens to be the state with the fastest growing appetite for data center construction in the entire country.
You caught the most interesting omission, which is Texas. And the reason is that the Texas grid, known as ERCOT, operates almost entirely outside of federal jurisdiction by deliberate historical design.
That is such a fascinating wrinkle because it means Texas essentially gets to write its own data center rules while the rest of the country waits on these federal directives to land.
It genuinely does create a 2-track system, and some analysts believe Texas will use that independence as a competitive advantage to attract even more hyperscale projects in the coming years.
Let's talk about the clock because the thing that struck me most about these orders is just how aggressive the deadlines are compared to the usual glacial pace of energy regulation.
The timelines are remarkably tight, and that is the real story. Within 30 days, each operator must file a mandatory reliability report on how they will secure enough generation capacity.
30 days in the world of grid planning is essentially overnight. So walk me through the second deadline because I believe that one is even more consequential for ordinary households.
Within 60 days, the operators must justify why their existing pricing structures can fairly accommodate these enormous data center loads, or they must reform those pricing structures right away.
And this is where the conversation stops being abstract and starts hitting people's monthly electricity bills, which is honestly the part of the story that I think deserves the most attention.
That is the heart of it, because FERC explicitly barred what is called cost shifting, meaning the cost of building infrastructure for data centers cannot quietly land on ordinary residential ratepayers.
Can you give a concrete example? Because I think when people hear cost shifting, they nod along without realizing how much money we are actually talking about in real communities.
Here's a striking one. Maryland ratepayers are projected to pay roughly $1.6 billion over the next decade for transmission projects largely built to serve out-of-state data centers.
That number is genuinely staggering because it means families in Maryland could be subsidizing the power infrastructure for server farms that may sit in an entirely different state altogether.
And that exact dynamic is why this became politically bipartisan, which almost never happens in energy policy these days. Yet here we have governors from both parties aligned on the same concern.
Tell me more about that political alignment, because when I see both parties agreeing on something this technical, it usually signals that voters are already feeling the pain in a very tangible way.
Back in January 2026, the White House National Energy Dominance Council joined all 13 governors of the PJM region in a statement demanding data centers bear their own load growth costs.
So this June action from FERC is really the regulatory follow-through on a political promise that was made earlier this year, which gives it a lot more staying power.
That is exactly the right framing. and it also fulfills a 2025 request from the Department of Energy Secretary. So this has momentum from both the political and the agency side.
Let's zoom out on the scale of impact, because I want listeners to grasp just how many people are sitting inside the footprint of these 6 orders that FERC just handed down.
The numbers are enormous, and they really put this in perspective. These regions collectively serve roughly 200 million Americans spread across more than 30 states, plus the District of Columbia.
200 million people is well over half the country. So this is not some niche regional squabble. This is a national reshaping of how AI infrastructure connects to power.
And the connection piece is genuinely the bottleneck, because there is something called the interconnection queue. And right now it can take years for a large project to actually get plugged in.
Help everyone understand that queue, because I think the idea that you can build a $1 billion facility and then just wait in line for power feels almost absurd to outsiders.
It does sound absurd, yet it is the daily reality. The interconnection queue is basically the waiting list for permission to connect new load or new generation to the transmission grid.
And these AI data centers are so large that they distort the entire queue, which I imagine is part of why FERC felt it had to step in with such urgency right now.
Exactly, because a single hyperscale campus can demand as much electricity as a mid-sized city. And that kind of concentrated load forces operators to rethink their planning assumptions from the ground up.
Before we go further, I have to ask the obvious question. Where is all of this new electricity actually going to come from? Because demand alone does not magically create supply.
That is the trillion-dollar question hiding inside this whole story. And the honest answer is a messy combination of natural gas turbines, revived nuclear plants, and a rapidly growing fleet of renewables.
I find the nuclear angle especially fascinating because we are suddenly seeing companies strike deals to restart old reactors that were shut down years ago, all to feed these power-hungry facilities.
It is a remarkable reversal, and it tells you how desperate the appetite has become, because reopening a retired reactor was almost unthinkable just a few years ago. Yet now it is a serious strategy.
There's also this idea of behind-the-meter generation, where a data center builds its own power source on site. So explain how that fits into this regulatory picture for our listeners.
Behind the meter essentially means the facility generates electricity right next to its servers, often with on-site gas or future small reactors, which lets it sidestep parts of the congested public grid.
But that approach creates its own thorny questions, because if these giant users pull away from the shared grid, who is left holding the cost of maintaining all that common infrastructure?
You have just identified the core of the PJM co-location fight, which FERC has been wrestling with through compliance filings in December 2025 and again in February 2026.
And meanwhile, the capacity auctions that set wholesale power prices have been spiking, which I understand is already flowing through to higher bills for regular customers across several of these regions.
That is correct, and it is the quiet mechanism most people never see, because surging data center demand tightens supply, and tighter supply pushes those auction prices sharply upward for everyone connected.
There is a phrase the industry keeps using that I love, which is speed to power. So define that for everyone, because it captures the entire competitive race in just 3 words.
Speed to power simply means how fast you can go from signing a lease to actually energizing your servers. And right now, that single metric determines who wins and who loses in AI.
And the builders themselves, the hyperscalers and the big model labs, are increasingly willing to fund their own substations and generation just to shave months off that speed to power timeline.
They absolutely are. And that willingness is reshaping the negotiation. Because when a builder offers to pay for its own infrastructure, the cost-shifting concern eases, but new fairness questions immediately take its place.
So if these orders work as intended, what does the landscape actually look like a year or 2 from now for both the data center builders and the everyday consumer?
If it works, we likely see shorter queue backlogs, faster approvals for well-financed projects, and new retail rate categories specifically designed for these large loads in more states across the country.
I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, because faster approvals sound great for the AI industry, but I worry about whether the grid can physically keep up with that pace.
That is a completely fair concern, and it is precisely why FERC paired the speed mandate with that 30-day reliability report, forcing operators to prove the lights stay on for everyone.
So the regulator is essentially trying to thread a very fine needle, accelerating connections for AI while simultaneously guaranteeing that reliability and consumer protection do not get sacrificed in the rush.
That is the balancing act in one sentence, and honestly, it reflects the central tension of this entire AI moment, which is reconciling explosive digital growth with stubborn physical infrastructure limits.
Let me push on the skeptical side again, because some critics will argue that FERC is bending over backwards to accommodate trillion-dollar tech companies that can clearly afford to build their own power.
There is real merit in that critique, and the counterargument is that AI compute has become a matter of national competitiveness. So the government sees fast grid access as a strategic priority worth enabling.
And that strategic framing connects directly to the broader race we keep discussing on this show, where compute capacity is increasingly treated as the new oil of the global economy.
It absolutely does, because if data centers cannot get power quickly in America, the builders will simply take their projects and their capital to countries with faster and more accommodating energy regimes.
So in a strange way, these dry regulatory orders are actually a front line in international competition, even though they read like the most boring documents you could possibly imagine on the surface.
That is the beautiful irony of infrastructure policy, because the most consequential decisions often hide inside the least glamorous paperwork. And this FERC action is a textbook example of exactly that phenomenon.
One last practical question before your closing thought. Among these 6 operators, which one do you expect to move first and effectively set the template that everyone else will follow?
I would watch PJM interconnection most closely. Because it is the largest operator, it faces the heaviest data center pressure, and its filing will almost certainly become the bellwether for the others.
And it is worth remembering that the entire world is watching this American experiment, because the same electricity crunch is arriving in Europe and across Asia at almost exactly the same moment.
That global dimension is crucial, because whatever model the United States lands on for balancing AI growth against grid reliability will likely become the reference point other major economies study and adapt.
Before we wrap, give our listeners the one thing you would want them to remember if they forget every specific number and date that we discussed during this entire conversation today.
Remember this: the fight over AI is no longer just about chips and models. It is now fundamentally a fight about electricity, and whoever controls the grid ultimately controls the pace of progress.
That is a powerful note to land on, and I think it reframes how all of us should watch the AI story unfold over the rest of this very eventful year.
I could not agree more, and I would encourage everyone listening to start paying attention to their own regional grid operator, because these decisions will eventually touch every single utility bill they pay.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.